Welcome back, everyone. Ready for some more trending tidbits? This time we're diving into the world of espionage, like CIA, MI6, all that, to see how they learn languages so quickly.
It's fascinating, really. Their methods are surprisingly relevant for anyone, really, who wants to learn a new language or even a few new languages fast.
And get this, the goal isn't actually perfect fluency, which might surprise you.
Yeah, it's more about what we call operational fluency. That means you can communicate in real situations, but you don't sound like a textbook.
Right, because sounding too perfect could actually raise suspicion, right? I remember a quote from, I think it was that Gullareme Languages video, where a former CIA officer said, sounding like a native could be a bad thing when you're undercover.
Exactly. It's all about blending in and communicating clearly, not about sounding exactly like someone from that country.
So ditch those anxieties about the perfect accent, all right? It's more important to get your message across. Think about it. If you suddenly show up in some, say, rural village with impeccable French, wouldn't that raise a few eyebrows?
For sure. And that applies to anyone learning a language. Focus on communicating, not sounding like a native speaker. Now, one place a lot of intelligence operatives train is the Defense Language Institute, or DLI. And I've got to say, those videos from Ollie Richards and Dima Havrilenko really paint a picture of how intense it is.
Oh yeah, it sounds like a language boot camp on steroids. Richards talked about these scream and scribble sessions for learning new alphabets. It sounds a little chaotic, but I guess there's a method to the madness. What's the thinking behind that?
Oh, absolutely. They use a lot of active multisensory learning techniques at DLI. Basically, the more senses you engage, visual, auditory, even kinesthetic, the faster you'll learn and the more you'll remember it.
Makes sense. Then they've got that isolation immersion facility.
Yep.
They drop students into this simulated environment and they have to, like, navigate everyday stuff using only the target language.
Right. Think like navigating an airport or ordering food, all entirely in the new language. It forces you to actually use your skills, right?
Yeah, totally. It's like a pressure cooker for language learning. But aside from the intensity, what I found really interesting were the unconventional techniques they use. One that stood out was this anti-routine strategy.
Oh, yeah. Ollie Richards explained that one. The idea is to deliberately change up your study habits. It kind of keeps your brain on its toes, right? Like if you always study at home in the evenings, try going to a cafe or studying in the morning, or even something as simple as ordering your coffee in a new language.
So you're keeping your brain from getting, like, stuck in a rut. It makes you a more adaptable learner.
Exactly. And speaking of unusual techniques, there's the memory palace.
The memory palace. Sounds like something out of Sherlock Holmes. How does that even work?
Well, picture it like this. Imagine you're walking through a place you know really well, like your house. As you walk, you mentally place bits of information, the things you want to remember in specific locations. To recall it, you just retrace your steps and pick up those mental notes.
So instead of just cramming words into your head, you create this vivid mental map that helps you remember things.
Exactly. And studies have shown it really works. Spies often use this technique to memorize high-frequency words. Those are the most common words that pop up in everyday conversations, like the a, is, and.
Right, like the building blocks of a language.
Exactly. By mastering those high-frequency words, you can understand the gist of a conversation much faster.
So it's not about knowing every obscure vocabulary word. It's about being able to communicate effectively.
That's the key. It's about practical application, which aligns perfectly with what a spy needs, to become operational in a new language as quickly as possible.
This is so fascinating. It seems like these are techniques anyone can use, even if we're not, trying to infiltrate some top secret meeting. What other tips can we take from the world of spy language learning?
One of the biggest is the emphasis on actually using the language. You can't just study in a vacuum. You need to get out there and put your knowledge to the test in the real world.
And speaking of real-world pressure, one video mentioned a story about a spy having to take a polygraph test in Russian.
Oh yeah, that one from Ollie Richards. That really highlights how they train for high-pressure situations. It's about being able to function under pressure, not about being perfect.
Practice makes perfect, right?
Right.
But with a spy twist, I guess.
Exactly. And this is where it's so helpful to find ways to create those real-world situations. Dima Havrilenko had a great tip in his video. He suggested switching your phone and other devices to your target language.
Oh, that's brilliant. Like instant immersion, right in your pocket.
Mhm.
Forces you to think in the language, even if you can't travel to that country.
Right. That constant exposure, even in small ways, can make a big difference in how fast you learn.
And of course, finding language partners to practice with, whether online or in person, is key, right? Those regular conversations are essential for building fluency and confidence.
Absolutely. Speaking with native speakers helps you refine your pronunciation, pick up new vocabulary, and get comfortable with the flow of the language.
And here's where it gets even more interesting. Spies don't just rely on words. They're masters of code switching and body language.
Think of code switching as seamlessly shifting between languages. Spies use it to blend in so they don't stand out.
So it's not just speaking fluently, it's knowing when and how to switch between languages depending on the situation.
Right. And body language plays a huge role, too. Spies are really good at reading those subtle cues like facial expressions and gestures to understand what's not being said out loud.
It's like they have this secret decoder ring for human behavior. They pick up on nuances that most people wouldn't even notice.
Exactly. It's an aspect of communication that often gets overlooked in traditional language learning.
So are you telling me there are spy-level language learning tools that I can use? That sounds almost too good to be true.
Well, there are some amazing resources out there that are available to everyone, like the GLOS system, the Global Language Online Support System.
Hey, what exactly is that?
Oh, it's this incredible collection of language resources, from listening exercises and cultural insights to all sorts of things. It was developed by the Defense Language Institute, but anyone can access it.
Wow. And if you really want to test your language aptitude, you can even find practice DLAB tests online.
Yep, the Defense Language Aptitude Battery. That's the test they use to see how well someone might be able to learn a new language.
So even if we're not training for a career in espionage, we can still get a taste of the DLI experience.
Exactly. It's a challenging way to gauge your language learning strengths and weaknesses.
This has been so eye-opening. Who knew there were so many valuable lessons we could learn from the world of espionage?
It's all about having the right mindset and using the right techniques. And as we've seen, many of those techniques are actually really accessible and can be adapted for anyone.
Before we move on, I do have one question. What does it actually mean to learn multiple languages at the same time?
That's a great question. It doesn't necessarily mean studying them all at the exact same time every day. It's more about strategically fitting them into your routine and finding ways to connect them, which we can delve into after a quick break.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Let's take a short moment and then come back to explore how to apply these principles to mastering multiple languages at once.
So picking up where we left off, let's talk about learning multiple languages at the same time.
Yeah, that's what I'm curious about. Can you really use these spy techniques for that? How would it even work?
Absolutely. Remember how we talked about operational fluency? Not aiming for perfection, but being able to communicate? That's super important when you're tackling multiple languages.
So you're not getting bogged down in like every tiny detail of each language.
Exactly. It's about getting to a level where you can function in real-world situations.
Mhm.
And that actually ties into how the DLI structures their training. They categorize languages based on how hard they are for English speakers to learn.
So like Spanish and French would be easier than, say, Arabic or Mandarin, right? Because of the different writing systems and grammar and all that.
Right. They get that different languages have unique challenges, and that's valuable for anyone learning multiple languages. It helps you prioritize, figure out where to put your energy.
So instead of trying to juggle three completely different languages, you might start with two that have some things in common and then add a tougher one later on.
Exactly. And even within those categories, the program lengths vary a lot. Like a Category 4 language like Korean might take 64 weeks of intensive study, but a Category 1 language like Spanish could take half that time.
Wow, it's amazing how much they cram into those programs. They must have some pretty effective techniques.
They do, and one key element is cultural immersion. It's not just about memorizing words and grammar rules. It's about understanding how people actually use the language.
So like if you're learning Spanish, you'd also learn about Spanish customs and traditions to get a better feel for how people communicate, right?
Exactly. The DLI brings in cultural elements throughout the programs, guest speakers, cultural days, all sorts of stuff. They get that language and culture are intertwined.
And that's especially important when you're learning multiple languages because you're basically jumping into multiple cultures at once.
Exactly. It's about developing cultural intelligence, being able to understand and navigate different social situations.
Like becoming a global citizen, being able to connect with people from all sorts of backgrounds.
Precisely. And that's where the DLI simulations come in. They have these incredible mock villages where students can practice using their language skills in real-life situations.
So they might have to like get through airport security or haggle at a market, all in their target language.
Exactly. They even have scenarios that simulate military operations. It forces them to think on their feet and use their language skills under pressure.
Sounds intense but effective.
It is, and it really highlights how important it is to actually use the language you're learning. You can't just passively absorb information.
You have to get out there and practice. And that goes for whether you're learning one language or several.
Right. That's where things like switching your phone settings and finding language partners online come in handy. You can create these mini immersion environments in your daily life.
Speaking of language partners, how does that work when you're learning multiple languages? Do you need, like, a separate partner for each one?
Ideally, yes, having separate partners is best, but there are also ways to get creative and practice multiple languages at once.
Oh, that's interesting. How so?
Well, imagine you're learning Spanish and French. You could find a partner who speaks both, or even two separate partners who are willing to have a conversation where you all switch back and forth.
So instead of seeing the languages as completely separate, you're finding ways to connect them.
Exactly. It's a more holistic approach to language learning. It's recognizing that languages don't exist in isolation.
It's like you're creating this language learning ecosystem where everything reinforces each other.
Precisely. And you start to see these connections and patterns between languages, which really deepens your understanding.
This is a lot to take in. Can you summarize some key strategies on using these spy techniques to learn multiple languages at the same time?
Sure. First, prioritize and be strategic. Choose languages that align with your interests and consider how difficult they are. Maybe start with two that have some similarities, then add a more challenging one later.
So be realistic about what you can handle.
Exactly. Second, look for connections between the languages you're learning. Find partners who speak multiple languages or explore how grammar structures and vocab overlap.
So instead of keeping them separate in your mind, find ways to bridge them.
Right. And finally, immerse yourself as much as possible. Surround yourself with the languages and find ways to use them in real situations.
Like changing your phone settings, watching movies, listening to music, even trying to think in your target languages.
Exactly. The more you immerse yourself and actively use the languages, the faster you'll learn. And remember, don't be afraid to make mistakes. It's all about progress, not perfection.
Progress, not perfection. I like that.
Now, let's talk about some specific tools and resources that can help you on your multilingual journey, inspired by the world of espionage.
So we've talked about strategies and immersion and all that. What about actual tools and resources? Are there any, like, secret weapons in a spy's language learning arsenal that we can use?
There are actually. Remember we mentioned the GLOS system earlier? That's a great example.
VLOS, right. What did that stand for again?
The Global Language Online Support System. It's a huge collection of language learning materials developed by the Defense Language Institute. And the best part is, it's available to anyone.
So it's not just like flashcards and grammar drills.
Nope, it's got listening exercises, vocab builders, even stuff about culture and regional dialects.
So you really get a feel for how people actually use the language.
Exactly. And if you want to challenge yourself, you could even try some practice D-Lab tests.
The Defense Language Aptitude Battery, right. The one they use to assess language learning potential.
Yep, it's a standardized test, and you can find practice versions online. It gives you a taste of how the DLI evaluates language skills.
So even if we're not aiming for a career in espionage, we can still use these tools.
Absolutely. They're valuable for anyone who's serious about language learning. And those are just a couple of examples. There are tons of apps and websites and programs out there, and a lot of them use elements of these spy techniques we've been talking about.
It's amazing how many resources there are for language learners these days.
It really is. And that brings us back to the main point of this whole trending tidbits exploration. If spies can master languages under so much pressure, just imagine what you could achieve with the right approach and a little dedication.
It's pretty inspiring to think about. So for our listeners who might be feeling a little overwhelmed by all this info, what are the key takeaways?
Well, first, remember operational fluency. Focus on being able to communicate effectively, not on sounding perfect. Even spies prioritize clear communication over a perfect accent.
It's kind of freeing, right? Takes the pressure off.
Definitely. Next, immerse yourself as much as possible. Surround yourself with the languages you're learning, even if you can't travel to those countries. Change your phone settings, watch movies, listen to music. Even just try to think in those languages, create those mini immersion environments.
And don't forget to practice, practice, practice. Find language partners and talk, talk, talk. The more you use the languages, the better you'll get.
Right. And think about the DLI's approach. They prioritize, they focus on culture, they make sure people apply what they're learning. You can use those same principles in your own language learning.
This has been an awesome look into spy-inspired language learning. Who knew those secret agent techniques could be so useful for anyone?
It really shows you what's possible when you combine the right mindset, the right techniques, and a little bit of inspiration.
So, to our listeners, if language is a weapon, as they say in the spy world, what kind of arsenal are you building? What languages are you going to master? What doors are you going to open?
The possibilities are truly endless. Embrace the challenge and see what you can achieve.
That's it for this episode of Trending Tidbits. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into a fascinating topic. Until then, keep those language skills sharp, stay curious, and keep exploring.